Booktube. It's been a while since I've made a video, in part because I've been trying and struggling to make videos recently. I wonder if anyone else in the Booktube community has experienced that before. Anyway, I did want to take this opportunity to try to make a video to respond to the wonderful video that Jack at the channel Rambling Raconteur made recently about stories of Jorge Louis Borges. And it's such a wonderful introduction and exploration of the themes of Borges and why he's such an amazing writer. And in that video, Jack sort of seizes on and he focuses on one particular kind of theme, exploration, which is the way in which Borges seems to sort of subvert this idea of gnosis, of hidden knowledge, whereas in certain traditions, perhaps in the Christian tradition, there's a sense that attaining this secret religious knowledge is redemptive and empowering, whereas in Borges' short stories, often that kind of secret knowledge is destructive. And my first reaction to that sort of exploration that Jack opens up there is that in the Jewish tradition, this is a very familiar concept. This idea of gnosis, of hidden knowledge, of secret knowledge, as being destructive. In the Talmud, there's the story of like the four sages that entered Pardes, and this is understood as like a metaphor for attaining, secret Kabbalistic knowledge. And the Talmud says that one of them died, one of them went mad, one of them abandoned Judaism and the Jewish faith, and the fourth one was able to leave unharmed. So this idea, this concept of destructive, scrambling knowledge that Borges seems to tap into in so many of his stories feels familiar in that way. And there's other examples in the Old Testament. There are a few places where we have this like principle that if you touch the Ark of the Covenant, you die. And at one point, or in more than one point, you have instances of people inadvertently or mistakenly coming too close and dying because of their encounter with this divine object. And also in Kabbalistic lore and in sort of mystical Jewish tradition, the idea of pronouncing God's name carries this like deathly significance to it. And that comes up in the story Death and the Compass, which is one of the stories that Jack references in his video. We sort of have this theme sort of spelled out where this detective, Eric Lonrot, comes across this murdered body of this Kabbalist. And there's in the typewriter a piece of paper that says the first letter of the name has been written. And our detective understands that this is the like unspeakable name of God. And eventually he has like this encounter with his nemesis, Red Sherlock, and he read his nemesis describes him as follows: that I learned from reading a history of the Hasidim. Sherlock says, I learned that the reverent fear of speaking the name of God had been the origin of the doctrine that the name is omnipotent and occult. I learned that some Hasidim, in the quest for that secret name, had gone so far as to commit human sacrifice. And end quote. But this idea of the gnosis, the hidden mystical knowledge, being deeply tied up with death and with annihilation. Another example of the same concept in Borges' writing, one of my favorite, is from Three Versions of Judas. And in this story, we learn about this character, Nils Runeberg, who comes to certain troubling philosophical conclusions about Christianity. And because of his knowledge, his hidden knowledge that he acquires, he basically goes insane. And that story ends after he's sort of come across this knowledge. He felt that ancient divine curses were met in him. He recalled Elijah and Moses, who covered their faces upon the mountain so as not to look upon God. Isaiah, who was terrified when his eyes beheld the one whose glory fills the earth. Saul, whose eyes were blinded on the road to Damascus. And Rabbi Simeon ben Azai, who saw in the garden and died. That is reference to Pardes, which I just mentioned earlier. The famous wizard, John of Viterbo, who went mad when the Trinity was revealed to him. The Midrashim, who abominate those who speak the Shem HaMifarash, which is Hebrew for the explicit name, the secret name of God. Was it not that dark sin that he, Runeberg, was guilty of? Another story that Jack talks about in his video is the Aleph. And I think about the Aleph as an example of Borges trying to describe the experience of the finite coming into contact with the infinite, and this unmitigated fire hose of experience. And one of the things that's so interesting about the Aleph, certainly in the context of everything we've talked about until now, is how, in a way, benign the experience is. That these people in the story are like fairly petty. Borges is a fairly petty character who's talking with his deceased wife's brother, who's trying to be a poet and is sort of doing a bad job. But they're all sort of like fairly unimpressive in a way. And but they have this encounter with the infinite, not necessarily the divine, but just the infinite. This fire hose of experience through the Aleph, and there's sort of like this reorienting, maybe that Borges is exploring. What happens in this encounter. A text which for me is sort of like the prime example of the finite meeting the infinite is the Book of Job. And of course, there's many ways to read the Book of Job, and many different people are going to read it differently. But the way that I prefer to read the ending of that book is just such an encounter. This fire hose of unmitigated, infinite experience. Because the Book of Job, of course, asks the question of suffering, which is the fact that all of us suffer in our lives, and it has this sort of strange ending, where God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind in chapter 38, reading from the King James Version here. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measure thereof? Or who hath stretched the line upon it?" Skipping. "Who laid the cornerstone thereof when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it broke forth as if it had issued out of the womb?" And he goes on and on for a few chapters of this. And it's this apprehension of the infinity of creation. And I think that's the answer. I think that's the answer that Job gets. And it's sort of a strange answer, but I think to me it's a kind of a compelling answer that suffering is subjective. It's hard to say that because it feels so objective, certainly when you're suffering. But if you can reorient yourself, apparently, if you can reorient, not saying I can do this from experience, obviously, but I'm saying hypothetically that with reorient your life and your experience in the context of the infinite, and see your place in the grandeur of the universe, that kind of reorienting of perspective can mitigate the suffering that is attendant to the human condition. And there are examples of this in practice. These from all religious traditions. It exists in the Jewish tradition, and certainly I've seen it explicitly in all sorts of places in the Christian tradition of these martyrs, of these ascetics, of people who seem to succeed, in that kind of reorientation, and by plugging themselves in to the mysterium tremendum, this infinite mystery, this infinite marvel of a universe where everything sort of belongs in some sense. There's an ability to transcend the current moment in some sense. And one of the themes that I think Jack is hitting upon in his video, and it's something that I also really have enjoyed thinking about and exploring in the stories of Borges, is the intersection between redemption and death, redemption and annihilation, where philosophically speaking, to find enlightenment, to perceive the mysterium tremendum, to encompass all of reality and all of experience in a single moment is also to annihilate the self. Those two things seem, from a philosophical perspective, perhaps to be two sides of the same coin. And Borges seems to explore that. So, of course, you know, maybe a cute kind of example of that is the House of Asterion story, which Jack certainly talks a lot about in that video, where the Minotaur confuses his murderer with his redeemer, and that's a kind of a paradox that I think Borges loves to play with. There's one of my favorite playwrights of all time is an Israeli playwright named Hanoch Levin, and he has a play called The Child Dreams. And I remember a very memorable scene in that play when the refugees are fleeing their oppressors, and one of the characters is shot and killed, and he ends up dying, and the horrified refugees, someone has to like speak, to say something, and over this dead body, and he says, this man has solved the mystery that even King Solomon in his day was unable to solve. And of course, but he means by that, to solve the mystery is he's dead. He's redeemed. He's free in a sense, in a way that we, these characters, aren't. Another kind of tongue-in-cheek example of this is from the story "The Cruel Redeemer Lazarus Morel," which is from Borges' book "The Universal History of Iniquity," which is sort of like these stories of like these very evil characters, basically. And you have this man who's promising these slaves in antebellum South their freedom if they rise up against their masters, and he's trying to like incite all these slave revolts, and he's helping slaves escape, and but then selling them for profit ultimately. So he does not ultimately give these slaves the freedom that he promised them. Eventually, this cruel redeemer Lazarus Morel would kill these runaway slaves if necessary, to protect himself. And Borges describes this as follows: the runaway expected his freedom. Therefore, the nebulous mulattoes of Lazarus Morel would give a sign, which might have been no more than a wink, and the runaway would be freed from sight, hearing, touch, daylight, iniquity, time, benefactors, mercy, air, dogs, the universe, hope, sweat, and from himself. And again, that's the that paradox of redemption and annihilation that I think Borges loves to play with. A story that I love, and I think a story that sort of brings together a lot of these threads into one place, is the short story "The Zahir," where Borges comes into contact with this object, which has like this mystical power over him, and the object arrests his focus. So it's a coin in this particular instance in the story, and all of Borges' focus is drawn to this coin, and it takes over every other element of his life. It's like this narrowing in of experience. And Borges describes that eventually he's going to be insane because of this. All he will apprehend is this Zahir. So essentially he's being annihilated by this closing in, this focusing of his experience. And he describes this as follows: before the year 1948, Julia's fate will have overtaken me. I will have to be fed and dressed. I will not know whether it's morning or night. Skipping. I will no longer perceive the universe. I will perceive the Zahir. Idealist doctrine has it that the verbs to live and to dream are at every point synonymous. For me, thousands upon thousands of appearances will pass into one. A complex dream will pass into a simple one. Others will dream that I am mad while I dream of the Zahir. In order to lose themselves in God, the Sufis repeat their own name or the 99 names of God until the names mean nothing anymore. I long to travel that path. Perhaps by thinking about the Zahir unceasingly, I can manage to wear it away. Perhaps behind the coin is God. End quote. The sense that in the focusing of experience, in the this repetition, this getting lost in experience, this apprehension of the single thing, which is sort of the dual, the opposite, but parallel to apprehending everything, is apprehending the one thing. There's the loss of self. There's the there's the reorienting of self. There's a kind of simultaneous annihilation and redemption. There's a spiritual attainment and also a kind of individual destruction going on simultaneously. In his video, Jack asked this question: Is life a mistake? Is consciousness a mistake? According to Borges, he references Thomas Ligotti as an example of someone who would say that consciousness is a cosmic mistake, and he sort of raises this question of what Borges would do with that. And I think the answer to that question is actually in a quote that Jack reads very early on in his video from the opening of Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius. Jack read the quote that for one of those Gnostics, the visible universe was an illusion, or more precisely, a sophism. Mirrors and fatherhood are hateful because they multiply and proclaim it. So I wonder, a possibility that if you ask Borges, is the world good or bad? Is the world evil or a good thing or a positive thing? Is it a mistake or not a mistake? He might answer,
it's a sophism.
Asking that question is a category error because it's neither. Because I think for Borges and philosophically, I think it comes across clearly in his essays and comes across even more clearly in his fiction. For Borges, the world is a construction of the mind. It's in a sense illusory. It doesn't have substance to it. It's not really there. And so is it good or bad? Well, I mean, if you think it's real, then that's a reasonable question to ask. But if you can be undeceived, if you can see through it, if you can see it for the chimera and the mirage and the illusion that it is, well, then it's neither good or bad. It just is.